Mm. And I actually have not introduced you two yet, so I would love to get to give an introduction to both of you, if I may, because there may be some folks in the audience who aren't entirely familiar with your background, and so and this is actually going to be available on our YouTube channel, so for people to view later. So if it's okay with you, I would like to introduce you. You're both here to discuss this beautiful book right here, um, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, Indigenous Voices, introduced 28 precepts for rebalancing life on planet Earth. So first, I would like to introduce Four Arrows, an you're internationally respected for your research and publications about Indigenous worldviews. You're formerly Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota College and tenured Associate Professor of Education at Northern Arizona University. Um, Currently a professor with Fielding Graduate University, and selected as one of 27 visionaries in education. Also the author of 21 books, half of which are about Indigenous worldview applications for education, sustainability, wellness, and justice. So welcome, Four Arrows. And Darcia Narvaez is Professor Emerita of Psychology at the University of Notre Dame. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Educational Research Association, and former editor of the Journal of Moral Education, and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Narvaez has written numerous publications, including more than 20 books. She's also the founder and host of evolvednest.org. So, with that, I welcome you both and thank you so much for coming. And this is where I will become invisible.
Thank you so much, Claire, for all of
Thank
your
you.
guidance in this process. Darcy and I wanted to kind of go through some real basic ideas so that we can stimulate some questions. And I think Darcy is okay. Can I start with just kind of deciding what a worldview is for people and giving
Can
some
I
information?
can I say something first
Yeah.
before that? We believe that the original indigenous understanding of the world, which we call the kinship worldview, offers the most crucial way to balance life systems. It's not romantic, it's ancestral wisdom. We've selected speeches in this book and writings from indigenous leaders that reflect indigenous worldview precepts rooted in the ancestral human nature and collective unconscious that we share. The precepts represent different dimensions of life. Some are principles put into practice, some are assumptions about how the world works, some are guidelines for behavior and living a good life. And we consider the precepts to be the essential starting place for bringing balance back into the world. What's a worldview?
So, what a worldview is, and just to I like to tell everybody what we're going to do so that you know what we're going to do. I'll talk a little bit real quickly, try to be less academic than I'm usually about what a worldview is, and then Darcy is going to talk about how the two worldviews, the dominant one that most of us are following, and the indigenous one that's struggling to survive. Um, then we're going to talk about distinctions between worldview and place-based knowledge, and then we'll going to talk about the up and down ways to get to change our worldview or to get into a place where we are in our kinship worldview. And then I'm going to offer a technique that Dr. Michael Fisher refers to as a dehypnotizing technology to help us move quickly into beginning to move back into our original nature-based worldview. So, in terms of what a worldview is, just starting with the concept. Darcia and I don't really like it because the indigenous worldview isn't a visual thing; it's an essence of being. But it's a word that is here to stay and being used in the scholarship and in the folklore. Um, it was originally introduced for just a moment or two by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He briefly introduced the word, it was in German, it is Weltanschauung, which really meant intuition of the world, your intuition of the world. And it was in the peak of the Enlightenment of Europe and it was about thinking without contradiction is what he was, what undertoned it. But it caught like wildfire, and the other, Enlightenment philosophers, Paine, Rousseau, Spinoza, Voltaire, they were talking about happiness and freedom and political structures that were egalitarian and social hierarchies being problematic, and religious faith versus science was a part of that. Now, many say that when the death of Kant happened, that was really the end of the Enlightenment. So he really was at the peak of it, and then they kind of closed it off. Interestingly, a new book came out by I think Graeber and Wingrove. I think are the author's name. 700 pages. It's called The New Dawn of Everything, and it shows how these ideas of democracy and freedom from the Enlightenment really didn't emerge from the Europeans, because they didn't have anything to base that on. It really emerged from American Indian intellectuals, some of them who were slaves that had been brought to Europe and then returned, who reported on the materialistic ways and the unhappiness, and compared it to the ways that they had been taken away from. Also, first contacts, reports, like even Columbus, who said in 1492 in his journal about the remarkable generosity of the people who met him on the shores of what we call the Bahamas today. And so a lot of connections to research start from that. But then in the 1890s, 100 years later, the theologian James Orr, who said the idea was indispensable, which it has proven to be, he claimed that religion was a worldview, specifically Christianity. And today, if you Google worldview on like Amazon, you'll see thousands of books, and they're all religious books, kind of trying to come back to what the battle that they think that their religions think they lost with science, because that was the original kind of duality that was in existence. And that duality, that binary of religion versus science, really didn't encourage dialogue like our worldview chart does. And when we also look at anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric, etc., hierarchical versus non-hierarchical, we look at these in a different way that we'll talk about, that encourages dialogue. But in any case, the idea is simply, I like Anneke Hedlund de Wit of the Institute of Environmental Studies in Amsterdam. She says worldviews can be understood best as inescapable, overarching systems of meaning and meaning making that to a substantial extent inform how humans interpret, enact, and co-create reality. I like a more simple version by Abraham Cooper. He says a life system is what it is. It's a life system. It's rooted in a fundamental principle from which was derived the whole complex of the ruling ideas and conceptions about reality that we live with. And so worldview for us umbrellas almost all religions, almost all cultures, almost all beliefs can be placed under one of these two worldviews. And this was a theory of the great anthropology, the father of anthropology, Robert Redfield. So that's what a worldview is. So Darcia, you want to kind of talk about the differences between the two worldviews?
Yeah, so the worldview, the way we understand it is that it's kind of a delocalized understanding of how we are, what the purpose of humans are, how they're related to the natural world, how they're related to the universe. And the indigenous perspective, the kinship worldview, is very broad. It's very, in other terms, right hemisphere oriented, seeing and feeling and sensing and understanding connection to nature, spirit, and others. So that is this broad perspective that we see among indigenous peoples, First Nation peoples, all over the world, the same kind of spiritual and connectedness orientation. Manitongkwat suggested that the original instructions, this worldview orientation, is not an idea, it's reality. It's about natural law, the way things are. It's the operational manual for a working creation. And so we have now been oriented to through our schooling, through the way the media and the institutions operate, to this very narrow orientation, very bureaucratic kind of mindset of utility and categorization and separation and deadness of the natural world and no spirit, disenchantment of the world, essentially. That's the dominant worldview, which another term would be, and people would say, like Ian McGilchrist, left brain orientation. And that's really dominated the Western civilization for especially the last millennia, but even before that. And it takes over. Ian McGilchrist talks about you come to each situation with one perspective or the other, and it's really hard to switch out of them. And that's why looking at the precepts and the contrast between them is really important so that you start to move away from that dominant assumptions that just pervade our atmosphere, right? And so learning and relearning the worldview is really critical for saving our species, essentially. And I think studying the chart, which you can find, I'll put that link in the chat shortly, where you can download the 40 precepts that Four Arrows has identified, has named, and the contrast between the two kinds of worldview. And think about how maybe you want to be on the kinship side, but is that how you're acting? Is that how you're setting up your life? Is that how your institution is working, right? Because we're so caught up in the dominant view, it's hard to move out of it unless we consciously start to make the decisions to do so.
I really like how you're using this idea of pervasiveness and how what you just said about you may have a feeling that, yes, obviously it's better to have a higher respect for women than a lower respect, or to be more spiritual than materialistic, or, whatever the 40 precepts that we have in total, but the 28 that we have in the book. Um, and an example, I think, of how we can do this so that we're not doing this George Bush thing of you're either with us or against us, not this absolutism, like you say, is to avoid its pervasiveness and to say, well, wait a minute, maybe I believe in this, maybe I do believe that this is a better way, but am I living that, or am I following an education system, or teaching in an education system, or running a business, or raising my whatever it is? Are you which of those 40 things are you really doing in reality, even though they're just going against your own heart? I think that's such an important thing. And it's also important to know that we're not talking about completely throwing away the dominant worldview precepts and going all the way over, because for example, in the book that I just mentioned, The New Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wingrove talk about the Lakota, who I know intimately as a Lakota sun dancer, and say that they were like all the indigenous cultures, or most of them were egalitarian cultures, except there were exceptions. When they would go hunting for the buffalo, during that time, they would move away from this total egalitarian, self-autonomy, non-leader kind of orientation that they lived most of the time with, into an authoritarian hierarchy. And the goal of that was to make sure that the hunting went well, to bring food back for everybody. But the people who played the role of that authoritarian figure, it rotated constantly. So it was not one person always. Each season was a different person, and it had this temporary thing. So we're not really saying that everything is bad and everything is good. So I really like this idea of the problem is we're not aware of how our worldview is guiding us, and how we're not resisting it. And we're going to talk about how to change that, but it is too pervasive. So I really like how you said that. And just briefly, I wanted to talk about a distinction that's real important, I think, to make between indigenous worldview and what the literature in sustainability calls TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. Um, Darcia and I are not here talking about specifically place-based knowledge, because you have to be able to speak your 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 mother tongue fluently, know the ceremonies, have been brought up for generations in one place, have this verb-based indigenous language that is of the earth, not about organizational systems, and that we're losing. We're losing that um, just so rapidly and so tragically, and have been for the last couple of hundred years. We've got to do everything we can to fight for indigenous, local, First Nation sovereignty, to bring truth into education, to bring forth the idea that, wow, we can learn a worldview from the people who are actually practicing that in a location. But what we're talking about is the broad in common factors that the great diversity of First Nations who are still holding on against all odds to this way of being. We're talking about those in common things, just like there are the great diversity of Western European cultures, but under them and that great diversity, they have a worldview that's very different. So I just want to make that distinction. And
and
so,
we,
yeah, go
we
ahead. I was going to say you.
yeah, we advise that you support then the native peoples wherever you are and worldwide, because they have this knowledge about how to maintain the well-being of the rest of the nature, the ecological wisdom about what works well to keep the animals alive and the plants thriving. That's also being lost, but that's the most of the biodiversity that remains on the earth, 80% of it remains on the lands that are controlled by native peoples, indigenous peoples, the 20% of the lands. And this is a United Nations study. So
If I could,
yeah,
if I could just jump in there, I just got an email I just briefly looked at because it seemed relevant, but it's from Proven Sustainable, a group that's out there trying to promote the indigenous worldview, and it's research showing current indigenous cultures from all over the world, and how they are still continuing to try to do what we're saying, with the understanding that many cannot or are not. But there's this list, so I want to share that with you, Darcia, and hopefully, if anybody wants to look at it, I'll find out if we have permission to send it out. But I just got that, which underscores what you're saying.
so proven sustainable.
Yeah.
Okay, then the next thing we wanted to talk about is how is a worldview shaped? So I'll start. In my area of research these days is how early life experience shapes your capacities, your neurobiology, how well your immune system works, how well your brain works, the neurotransmitters, your stress response system. All these things are shaped by the care you receive in early life. And then that affects your perceptions, your memory, your intelligences, your social skills, your morality, what kind of morality you favor. And what we study in my lab is what we call the evolved nest. So we've been around as a genus for 6 million years. We've been here as a species for 2 million. And during all those years, and even for 75 or maybe 300 million years, these same kind of practices of nurturing the young have been passed on generation to generation across the tree of life. I'm working on another book about the evolved nest, looking at different animals and how they provide the nest and how that compares with human nest provision. And our nest provision is really critical for building a properly functioning human being. And the dominant worldview has pushed us away from it horribly, and pushed everyone else away wherever it goes, because we misunderstand who we are. The evolved nest includes soothing perinatal experience, soothing pregnancy and birth, and after birth, not separating from mother, no painful procedures, no circumcision. There are other ways to welcome babies, breastfeeding for several years. It's magical. This mom has a science laboratory in her body, and she creates the milk that's necessary for that baby in that moment, and by boy or girl. And it's unique. and that builds the immune system. It builds the brain properly, and it needs to be for several years to do that. And there's positive moving touch, so lots of carrying and rocking and being physically skin to skin with that child, especially in the first years, all the time pretty much, in order to build the vagus nerve and other systems to function properly so that that child will be independent, will be healthy, will be happy as they move through life. And no negative touch, because spanking, we know, is equivalent now in the research to physical abuse, has long-term negative effects on the children. Might make a mom or dad feel good in the moment because the child stops doing whatever it is, but it's bad for the child, right? So we have to know other ways to get along with our children. Then there's nature connection and immersion to feel comfortable wherever you are. Every animal wants to explore everywhere they are and get to know that place and then feel bonded and safe there. We need that too. Self-directed play with multiple playmates is really important for us as mammals. Builds the brain, all sorts of genes get turned on. We learn leadership skills, self-control, all sorts of things, intelligences, a welcoming social climate so that the child, the baby, is kept in a very positive biochemistry in a social climate that's serene and joyful and expansive and not fearful, angry, or full of dread. And then there's responsive care, which means keeping babies at the optimal biochemistry so that they are growing properly. Otherwise, you can misdirect growth. If you distress them, you leave them to cry, leave them alone. Very distressing for a baby. And then multiple adult responsive caregivers, because babies need so much. They need that 24/7 presence. And finally, we know from our Indigenous cousins all over the world that routine healing practices, ceremonies where you mend the misbalanced, out of balance body, psyche, relationships, or connection to nature. So all these things we study, we've got the neuroscience now to show that they all matter.
You know, Darcia, as you were telling these things that you've studied all your career at University of Notre Dame on how to raise children in the best ways, I was looking at the Worldview Chart and just kind of making a connection between some of the particular things that you said that we should do.
Should I show the chart because I can share my screen?
Yeah, I just think because I just think
Okay.
it's so amazing how someone out there in the audience might be going, well, okay, that makes sense, but I can't because I work and I have to leave real quick, or I don't have, I'm a single mom, or and yet if we look at the at non-hierarchical, if we had that kind of feeling over a child, wouldn't that make a difference? If we looked at the community welfare as part of your child rearing, the respect for gender, this empathy emphasis, the sacredness of words themselves, when we're in the presence of the child, the regular use of alternative consciousness. In other words, folks out there could look at this on the right side and maybe you might want to scroll up so they can see the bottom. They can look at these and begin to see how even doing ceremony at the young age for the child it's such a foundational thing to all the things that you have taught, and I kind of think that if we could get into this foundation, we might then be able to almost intuitively learn the things that you've been teaching.
Yeah, and one of the key things here for parents and for adults is to be generous towards the needs of babies, to be humble and have gratitude for their needs, to be able to touch and hold and be with them is the highest joy for adults typically. So, all right, then you want to talk about Cat Fawn? So I talked about the bottom-up way we get to the kinship worldview. When you build the human being the way we're supposed to be built, you end up with this kinship worldview because you've been immersed in it for your childhood and then into your adulthood.
Well, this is sort of the classic question of the chicken and the egg, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
But but for adults and corporations and education uh, who can begin this because obviously the human child is going to be largely molded by the what the parent does. This the nurture and nature thing is pretty much answered. Um, I had a vision after a near death experience of a mountain lion and a baby deer, a fawn that I had come upon on escaping out from the Rio Urik River, 8,000-foot canyon. And those two animals turned into neon lights as if it was in New York City. CAT, CATFAWN. And it stands for concentration activated transformation, which is really ceremony. It's hypnosis, if you will. It's trance-based learning. It's the understanding that willful determination from just left brain activity isn't sufficient. We have to really have this meeting place in the corpus callosum, according to one of the studies of one of my doctoral students, where the right and left brain energies converge into oneness. But the fawn stands for just 4 of our 40 worldview precepts. That if we just take those 4 to start with, we can begin this journey and then use the chart to kind of practice an in vivo experience of, okay, how am I going to be more of this than I have been at work today or with my children? And that's fear, authority, words, and nature for fawn. And in essence, if we understand that the indigenous worldview approach to fear, once the fight or flight mechanism is over for all of us, that's the escape or running or fighting. Instead of being afraid of fear and freezing and acting out of fear, we look at fear as a catalyst for practicing one of the great virtues: courage, patience, fortitude, humility, honesty, and generosity. And so I could tell some stories maybe, but I want to get into questions and answers about how to do that. This is a 2-week workshop, but so if we can look and say, well, in this challenge I'm facing, or in what am I doing that I could be doing better, whatever it is, a problem or a desire for enhancing your life and the life of those around you, what fear is operating? Identify it, and then look and say, have I been looking at it from a dominant worldview perspective or on the continuum that goes over to a fearless understanding that allows me to use it as a way to practice one of these virtues? Then you do the same thing with authority. And of course, these 4 things are interconnected, as are all of our worldview precepts. And that is, on whose authority do I have that fear? What was the source of my fear? Was it my father? Was it an early childhood trauma, which many of them are, if not most? Was it something that I learned from later on to believe? In the dominant worldview, we tend to give authority outside of ourselves as a large systematic structure.
Let me just say, we teach kids to do that. We punish children. We think they have to be coerced into being good. And so they learn not to trust themselves. And then they grow up and they feel unconfident and they rely then and they're dependent on others, right? Instead of having this internal compass that they're confident about, that's been nurtured and unfolded with help from all the elders.
Perfect example. And that sense of that inner compass, that's the highest authority in the indigenous worldview, is honest reflection on lived experience under the umbrella of recognizing interconnectedness, right? So compare that definition to, well, the Bible says so, or the law book says so, or the parent says so, or whatever, the president says so. Okay, so then the third one is words. And in the indigenous ways, Tom Cooper, our dear friend, who wrote the wonderful book A Time Before Deception, Dr. Cooper shows that when the European colonialists came over and broke treaties, initially indigenous tribes would do ceremony praying for their health, thinking that they had somehow become mentally ill. And otherwise, how could they not know reality, which was that we agreed on a particular thing, right? And so this idea of words, and we opened today with talking about vibrational frequencies, and there's a lot of both science and spiritual understandings about the vibrational frequency, whether it's Kundalini yoga or quantum physics, right? And if our words can be seen that way, even though the indigenous languages are verb based and very hard to categorize, you were talking about categorizing, it's very difficult to categorize with a verb based language, right? But we can work on, is this as honest of an expression that I can give? Boy, just doing that in concert with the fear and authority changes, then all we have next is one other thing before we go into the cat and do the hypnosis on what we have now understood to be the right thing to do. And that's why all the Olympic athletes who have won gold medalists, they learn the right way to jump over the high bar or what they do to get the fastest sprint at the finish. But if they use willful determination, they won't get it. They have to use hypnosis. That's why they hire sports psychologists like they used to do me. And so this this last thing is to take these ideas that we have and we're ready to implement out into nature. And nature can be, nature is us, even though all the dictionaries say nature is everything but us. That's kind of interesting. If you look at any definition of it's anything but a human, essentially. But if you go out into the world where there are trees and birds and insects, and it could be downtown New York, right, with the weeds coming out of the sidewalk and pigeons on the street, and you just take a moment to allow yourself meditatively to see what can you learn from that cockroach, what can you learn from that tree, and people will be really surprised at what they can bring back that applies to the initial problem or challenge that they use cat fawn with. So if we can start doing that now as adults and leaders and parents, and then do what you're saying as parents for the early childhood and infancy and prenatal of their kids, I believe that this could be done in a generation. Now, I don't have hope that it can be done. I'll tell everyone right up front. I believe hope is more of an illusion and more dangerous than it is good. I think hope should be defined as that what I'm doing is the right thing to do no matter what the outcome. But I kind of believe in what I call the optimism of hopelessness. And the optimism is that while you say, okay, I'm not going to have the expectation that somebody else is going to take care of this, I'm going to do it myself, but I am going to envision and visualize what I want to see happening in the world. And I think that that's really, really important. I think that's what Sitting Bull did. Is he didn't have hope that he was going to turn things around. It was possible, but he was visionary about how he wanted the future to be. So this is a good time for questions.
Yeah. So our the book, just a last statement, is really trying to plant seeds to help the reader find their way back to the kinship worldview. And we hope that will inspire you, though, to go further than that once you've read the book, to explore further our the materials, the speakers and the writers that we quote, so that you actually build your more place-based knowledge and your more specific knowledge of Indigenous ways. So are there questions? Claire, are there any questions? I'm not seeing any.
I'm not seeing any yet. I have definitely sent out an invitation. We would love to get get questions from folks who are watching. This book is just seems to be so rich. It's so full of knowledge and inspiration. I actually have a question myself, if I may, about the book. I'm intrigued by the illustrations. There's a few illustrations in the book. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I'd be honored to do that because the artist is a dear friend of mine, and Harriet Green, when she was a young lady, she was very highly respected sculptor, and she came upon the oratory of a number of American Indian leaders like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Chief Joseph, and she was so moved by their oratory. And this is really one of the reasons that we opened this book with all 28 precepts by an indigenous speaker, because the power of the language is really amazing. And so she was so moved that for 15 years she took 4-inch thick marble, 4 foot by I think about 2 feet slabs, and she hand stone cut with a hammer, and for 15 years. And she says she was in a state of hypnosis for 15 years. She just, and she had to do them backwards because she was going to ink them, in order to make those prints. And of course, then she also carved the image of the people. And so I asked her. I said I would be so honored if we could have those 8 additional speeches in addition to the 28 speeches that we have from past and contemporary indigenous voices, who are articulating in a really beautiful way how the particular worldview should be understood from their place-based knowledge and how we can do it. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think that they would show up. I mean, that's gorgeous. And to know that she did that backwards, because look at all the lettering. She did all,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
of that
15
backwards.
years.
That's
I've seen
beautiful.
the actual stone marble, and it's quite remarkable.
Oh,
Another
wow.
thing that often comes up in the questions when people are listening, they go, "Well, I don't really have the right to teach indigenous worldview. I feel like I respect indigeneity, but I don't want to misappropriate," because they've learned that misappropriation is a major problem in Indian country. And it's a very complex question, and I'm just going to offer my position on it, and I think Darcia's, and Darcia, you can jump in if you have a slant on it. But um, uh, the I understand both sides of it. One side is no one who is not truly indigenous, meaning speaking of the language, grown up in a indigenous culture as defined by the United Nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and because everything that they have done, the non-Indian has stolen from us, and now they're going to steal our spirituality. They're going to steal our way of thinking, and education is the last place it should be, because that's what started the problem. So I have dear friends, see, Sundance brothers and sisters, who tend to be in that camp. And I have a whole other group of indigenous people. I'll tell you a story, just a real brief story that will give you an example. My wife and I I'm a member of the STAR School, the Service to All Relations School, next to the Navajo Reservation, led by Mark Sorensen in Arizona, which is some of the worst schools in the world. But Mark has Navajo students coming off the res into his school, and does the most amazing work of educating. And it's all state sanctioned. And when we were raising some money for at the very beginning of the school, my wife was playing the banjo and I was playing the piano. And at the very end of our playing old time kind of jazz, I played a sacred uh, Inipi song, one of our Purification Lodge songs. It was a thank you song. I thought that'd be a great way to end it. And I sang it in Lakota and played it. And we were packing up the keyboard, and one of the respected Navajo spiritual leaders came up to me and scolded me. And he said, "Four Arrows, you know better than to take that out of the circle," because there were a lot of non-Indian people, from Flagstaff at this place. "You know better." And I patted him on the shoulder and I thanked him and said, we agree to disagree, my friend. Not a minute later, another very respected, I like to say more respected, but equally respected spiritual leader came up and hugged me and said, Thank you for taking that out of the circle and sharing that with people. That story kind of tells what I'm trying to say here, right? Now, Fool's Crow and White Standing Buffalo and Rick Two Dogs and a lot of people today, what I talk to, they say no one owns this medicine. Uh, Fool's Crow says anyone that thinks they do doesn't know the medicine, right? And so if we have a good heart, there's not enough. So many indigenous peoples have lost it. So you can be you. I know, and I have Navajo students, and I've got I know a lot of people from all over the world who have lost it, and understandably so because of the brainwashing and the oppression and all that, right? And so if we don't all, we're all indigenous to planet Earth. And if we don't remember the one, like Darcia said at the beginning, this isn't a way of thinking, it's how the world runs. And it happens to be that the people that we call indigenous, they don't own it. They just happen to have held on to it longer than others, knowing that the way nature works is the way we should all be working because we're not superior to nature, which is a worldview problem. And so I think that we should all get involved with worldview, not only for ourselves, but in helping others. As far as place space, Darcia said it well. We've got to help the cultures gain sovereignty that are fighting for it.
I can just add two things. From a scientific perspective, all the science is leading us to the indigenous worldview and the importance of place-based knowledge. It's just that's what's happening. It just kind of needs to hurry up and do faster and spread at everyone's mind. And then second, and so my science hat says, yeah, of course, this is it. You have to break through the silo science where people don't want to get out of their narrow view of what science is or one way of doing it or whatever. It has to be a broad, transformative, transdisciplinary science. And then from a personal perspective, we all have the shadows in our genes, in our instincts for the indigenous perspective. Children are connected to nature if you let them be outside and be out there when they're little. And it's the schooling that we do and the kind of the punishing that we do to get it out of them, right? So we shift them out of that mindset and into the left brain of schooling intellect stuff, which is a dangerous place to be, according to all major religions. That's where you don't want to spend very much time because you start to think you're better than other people, that this is who you are, this little detached kind of ego up there controlling and manipulating and even and so we don't want that to be who we are. It's not who we are. And we know that deep down, if we get connected to our hearts, we know there's something more, that we are connected. And we have to break through all those, cages that we've been putting on our hearts from being punished, from being persecuted for, thinking that the tree spoke to us or, there are spirits around as children. So we have to get back and we can do it. So it's not like it's anyway, that's my
Well, your emphasis on heart knowledge is a good way to, as we wind down here, because I noticed in the chat box that a young lady who is a doctoral student of mine, she's doing a dissertation on heart knowledge, and of course one of our worldview precepts that we have in the book is leading with the heart and following with the head. And so and more and more people, and she came upon this without prior knowledge of indigeneity, because all of these worldview precepts that we're talking about are intuitive. And interestingly enough, Immanuel Kant, in his one time of mentioning Weltanschauung, he called it the intuition of the world, and not probably knowing himself that this was how we lived without having a name for it, right? We lived from the leading with the heart. I know Rick Two Dogs, my Sundance leader, he used to say to me often, I would see a miracle happen from one of the Anipis or one of the ceremonies or one of the prayers or whatever. And as a scholar and an academic, he could see me, like trying to figure it out. And he would come up and put his arm around me and he'd say, "Hey, Doc, analyze that." Telling me, "Hey, let your heart figure this out, right? Let your heart figure this out." So I think talking about heart is an important thing, and maybe it would be good, Claire, if when we're ready to close, I'd like to play a flute song real briefly. That is a flute song that reminds. It was actually one that was sung by the women on the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee and Creeks were forced on a 1,500-mile uh, uh, march, and it was very tragedy. But the words were about. Did you see the beauty all around in spite of the horror? Did you see the beautiful animals in the clouds? Did you see the dancing prairie grasses? Did you see the beautiful colors of the fish when we crossed the brook? Did you hear the sounds of the meadowlark? And then speaking to, and they are still, planting seeds for us, and they are still doing this. And so let me know when you're ready, and we can kind of fade
I
out with that music.
I would love to hear that, and that speaks to a question that we did get in everything that you just said that's in that song. I'm wondering if it speaks to the question that we have here from Peggy. She says, "Four arrows. Would you elaborate on the optimism that you were speaking of when it comes to envisioning?"
That's a beautiful question. This concept of optimistic hopelessness is a phrase probably that if I say it often enough, maybe it will be coined, but it's a complex one. Um, I do believe that the illusion of hope is problematic. I know a lot of activists who have hoped that things are going to turn around, and then they go out and with their intelligence, they see that things have actually gotten worse. We can look at the carbon footprint as an example. Um, and they see that there's more and more dictators that are coming in, and that we're starting wars that are going to use more and more fuel and more carbon, and so they burn out. And Margaret Wheatley speaks about this in her books as well. Um, to define hope as not the certainty of an outcome, but the certainty that whatever you're doing is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome, speaks to an indigenous profile of fearless courage. Fearless courage is courage takes a lot of energy to do something over and over again. It can wear you out, and you can honor it, but you're going to burn out. But in indigeneity, and I've seen this over and over again in my 4 tours of duty at Standing Rock and in all the cultures around the world, from the Kogi to the Seri, once they commit to an action via intelligence and courage and praying and spirit has to be emphasized here, the spiritual energy and everything. They go into fearlessness, which means I am making the commitment by entrusting the universe. It's like if you're going to jump off of a cliff, um, you you have courage all the way down. You're going and you don't see anything, you don't feel it. But if you go up and it takes courage, and you go oh, and then once you jump, you go I'm committed. I trust the universe. Then you see the eagle overhead. You see the salmon swim underneath you. You feel the water molecules when you plunge, right? And so optimism is that visioning. Einstein said imagination is more powerful than knowledge. And if we can vision optimally what it is that we think is beautiful, we want to envision leading with the heart. We want to envision when we go into a room, getting in touch with the hearts and all whatever that is. We can do that and not have to go, well, I sure hope I'm going to make a connection tonight. I sure hope that this is going to turn out okay. I hope I'm going to be successful. No, you can just focus on the optimism and the images and go for it without that, because ultimately you could get disappointed and quit. I hope that helps.
Is
Absolutely. We do have in the chat, Jennifer is wondering if you could please restate the M. Wheatley thought on hope.
Well, she wrote the foreword for my book, Sitting Bull's Words for a World in Crisis. And if you read that, it says almost just what she didn't talk about the optimism part, but she did talk about the uh, definition of worldview being about um, fully committed regardless of the outcome.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much. Darcia, do you have anything to add?
Just that I think we have to, or remember to start unlocking your heart. So pay attention to the natural world wherever you are. We did an experiment some years ago that was published where we tried to nudge college students to do that throughout the day. So each day for 3 weeks, they had one thing they kept doing, like pay attention to the clouds today, acknowledge the trees you pass by. And so that gets you down in your body, in your senses, and you're connecting, right? And just those little things to get back to nature connection is really critical for changing the pathway that we're on.
Thank you. I like that. I'm going to try to do that. 3 weeks.
And we actually, if you go to Eco Attachment Dance, we have 28 days of doing that, little nudges.
Oh,
I'll put the thing in the chat. Yeah.
thank you. And I did put the link to the Village Books website where folks can purchase copies of the book if they so desire. Saturday happens to be Independent Bookstore Day, so if you are not near Village Books or wish to support your indie that's closest to you, I encourage you to do that. So thank you both so much for this evening, and thank you for putting that in the chat just there, Darcia.
And
Um,
Claire, I'm assuming that because there were a lot of folks that signed up that didn't make it, they are assuming that they can tune into this. You'll have it available for
it
them.
is going to be on our YouTube channel for all eternity, if it's okay with you folks.
It's really
And you'll put the links
Yes. Well,
in the,
actually, I will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with the YouTube
beautiful.
recording in that, so that they can go straight to it.
Thank you so much, Claire. We sure appreciate having the opportunity to.
yes, thank you so much. It's been a
Well, thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you. Okay, I guess we get to hear some music now.
Yeah, so just allow yourself to close your eyes and imagine being on something much worse than what we're experiencing in the world now in terms of intensity. Uh, if, and that's the Trail of Tears, and the mothers and the women replacing mothers who had died, singing this song of optimism.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.